Good morning. Welcome again. My name is Maureen Marshall. I'm the Outreach and Campus Programs Coordinator for the Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. Susanne Wengle is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She earned a Ph.D. in political science in 2010 from the University of California Berkeley, a master's degree from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and her bachelor's degree from the London School of Economics. Her book, Post-Soviet Power, will appear later this year with Cambridge University Press. Her work also appeared in studies in comparative international development, economy and society, Europe-Asia studies, the Russian Analytical Digest, and the Chicago Policy Review. Dr. Wengle's work has focused on the politics of market regulation and has included research on electricity reforms in post-Soviet Russia. She is currently working on a project on the political economy of food and agriculture in the United States and Russia. Please join me in welcoming Susanne Wengle to speak to us today on energy and politics in Russia and the former Soviet Union.
Great. I guess this works. Let me know if you can hear me in the back. Thank you, Maureen, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure and a privilege to share some of what I know about Russia. I have about 30 minutes, so I'll get to say a few things, but if you have questions about anything, please feel free to interrupt me right then and there or ask, or wait until the end. So what I want to do over the next 30 minutes is give you sort of an idea of the role of energy in Russia and CIS countries. And just briefly to clarify, CIS stands for the Commonwealth of Independent States. It's the successor countries of the former Soviet Union, of the former Soviet republics, excluding the 3 Baltic countries. So those were 12 countries. Georgia de facto opted out in 2009, and the status of Ukraine is currently unclear. So that's just an aside. A quick overview of my remarks. I'll talk about ownership and control of energy resources. Before I talk about politics, I'll talk about domestic politics and the role of energy in foreign policy. Most of my remarks, or the majority of my remarks, will be about Russia. It's the biggest country. It sort of has the largest natural gas and oil reserves, but I'll also touch on former Soviet countries. And in the end, I'll talk a little bit about Ukraine, just because it's so important right now. So, the first thing I want to talk about briefly is just resource wealth, how much resources they are. It's not, sometimes people think of the Middle East right away as where our resources come from. Europe's resources come largely from the Eurasian subcontinent, and those are the countries I'm talking about today. So Russia is the second largest producers of oil in the world. Second largest producer of natural gas, third largest producer of oil. I got confused quickly because those places actually switch quite regularly. For gas, it's the US and Russia that are the biggest producers. For oil, it's the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. So, and if you think of a table, I didn't have put the stats here, but these countries are really quite close in terms of production. And some years, Russia is actually the biggest producer. Generally, it's the second largest producer of gas and third largest producer of oil. So it also has very, very large reserves, especially natural gas reserves. It has the largest proven gas reserves. In fact, a quarter of the world's gas reserves are located in Russia. It also has very large coal reserves, and it doesn't actually mine nearly as much as it could for coal. Now, unlike the US, Russia exports much of its energy. Hence, its foreign relations revolve a lot about oil and gas exports. So Russia has the richest reserves in former Soviet countries. A number of Central Asian and South Caucasian countries also have significant reserves. In Central Asia, it's Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan is connected to Europe via Russia, via pipelines that go through Russia. Turkmenistan is connected to Europe via pipelines that go through the South Caucasus and Turkey. Uzbekistan has a lot of reserves, but it's very weakly collected in terms of pipelines. In the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan is the biggest producer. It's one of the oldest oil-producing regions in the world. I thought I'll show you some maps just to see how important oil and gas are for Russia. So the largest oil-producing regions in Russia are Western Siberia and the Caspian region. You'll see that in the Far East, there's a number of really important oil fields, but they're, in terms of production, still much, much smaller than Western Siberia. But they have a lot of potential. So this is important because Russia is trying to strengthen its links, its energy exports to China, Japan, and Korea. Therefore, we'll talk later about its dependency on Western Europe as a market. So the next map, so these are oil fields. The next map is gas fields. So you'll see that those are the red lines are pipelines. So again, the major producing regions are Western Siberia, which you'll see up in the middle on the top. You'll see that the majority of gas pipelines channel Russian energy towards Western Europe in various ways. I think there's about 12 pipelines. About 5 or so of those go through Ukraine right now. That's just a point on the side. The newest pipeline, the most recently built one, is the one it's called North European on that word. It's the Nord Stream pipeline. It's the only pipeline that connects Russia directly to Western Europe. What else did I want to say about this map? Sorry. So you'll see, if you sort of close your eyes a little bit and blink at it, it's really kind of an energy corridor. It's the Russian resources that are brought to Western Europe. And a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe, both the former Soviet countries of Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, and some of the Eastern European countries are sort of the transit countries. So these are important things to keep in mind when we talk about the politics of these countries. So the next thing we need to think about is who controls these resources. The one thing that distinguishes former Soviet energy resources from perhaps other regions is that the ownership has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. It's really a very dynamic, ownership and control is a very dynamic picture in Russia. And that's the case because until 1991, the Soviet government, so via sort of bureaucratic channels, controlled energy. So there was no company and no person who controlled all this resource wealth. The Soviet state collapsed in 91, and it was sort of a huge question, who was going to control these resources? The newly independent states, the Russian Federation, tried to keep control, but it was energy resources like other resources and factories and farms and everything were part of privatization programs. So what we can really talk about a wholesale transformation of ownership structure in the energy sector. Now, privatization is a huge topic. It's incredibly complicated and chaotic. One thing so I'm going to try to sort of summarize briefly what happened. So one of the attempts to privatize assets in the Soviet Union was the voucher privatization. So the idea of the voucher privatization was to give every Russian citizen a stake in the new market economy. So companies were privatized to workers via vouchers. So literally everybody would receive a voucher, which was kind of like a share, and they should become stockholders. Now, many things went wrong in the post-Soviet transformation, but nothing went quite as wrong as voucher privatization. So instead of creating this sort of broad-based ownership structure where every Russian citizen would be a property holder, what happened was that a very, very small number of privileged insiders managed to gain ownership of the most valuable resources. That's generally true of all resources and assets in the former Soviet Union, but it's also true, and it's also true in the oil and gas sector. So that's the story of the creation of the oligarchs, and you may have heard of the role of the oligarchs in Russian politics. Now, why did this happen? It happened because the rule of law in the 90s was very weakly institutionalized. There weren't really any laws that could prevent people from just, declaring de jure, first de facto, this is mine, I want to use it, and later turn it into sort of legal ownership. So rule of law was very weakly institutionalized. There were also no institutions to value assets. So people could just say, well, this is worth 1 million, whereas it was actually worth many billions. The effect was basically that a number of very well-connected insiders knew what assets were valuable, and they had the means and channels to declare them their own. So that's, to just give you an example from the oil sectors. Yukos was one of Russia's biggest oil companies. It accounted for 20% of Russian production in the late 90s and 2% of world oil production. It was a big company. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the oligarch who ended up controlling Yukos. He bought the core assets of Yukos for $300 million equivalent in the early 90s. The company was later worth many, many billions. It's hard to say how much they're worth. But he's one of a number of oligarchs who knew how to do it and did it. It was very he was able to take risks. He was in a good position to do it, and he acquired these assets. So in the gas sectors, the Russian government, that happened in the oil sector, sorry. The oil sector was explicitly privatized, and a number of private companies emerged. Lukoil and Yukos were the biggest private oil companies. In the gas sector, the Russian government retained more control. Gazprom, which you might have heard of, it's the largest Russian gas company, maintained control of all the gas assets, or the majority of gas assets. I think it's somewhere in 95%. But even though the company Gazprom maintained control, in the 90s, Gazprom itself was the government only owned a minority stake in the 90s because oligarchs were able to gain control of Gazprom assets. I will talk more about the role of Gazprom in a minute. So after 2000, the Russian government under Vladimir Putin sort of tried to reverse this trend. It was the Russian economy was in crisis. The Russian government realized that it wanted to and needed to reassert control of these energy resources to fill its budget coffers, basically. The oil and gas sectors account for a very large share of tax revenues in Russia. And the oligarchs were good at gaining ownership. They were also very good at not paying taxes. So starting around 2002, the state gradually but very steadily reasserted control of oil and gas sectors. The most well-known event in this process is the so-called Yukos affair, when the state arrested, indicted, and imprisoned Mikhail Khodorkovsky for fraud and tax evasion were the main counts. The assets of Yukos, which had been the largest Russian oil company, were renationalized. Basically, they were forcibly sold at very low prices, mostly to a company called Rosneft, which was a Russian government-owned oil company. So Rosneft subsequently emerged as the biggest Russian oil company because it had all the assets that Yukos had. The state also increased its share in Gazprom. It now controls a majority stake, and the government placed its ministers on the board of directors of Gazprom. So after about 2004, the Russian state reasserted control of these assets. So I said that the transformation of ownership for Yukos is called renationalization. I don't personally like that term very much because it sort of suggests that the state plays an overwhelming role. I think the oligarchs still maintain minority shares. They're still private oil companies. So that's what my research is sort of about these bargains between the state and the oligarchs. And I really think they're characterized by mutual dependence. So the state doesn't want to outright own these assets, but it wants to control them. It wants to control the oligarchs. It wants to install loyal leaders at these companies that help the state fulfill sort of its social, political, and economic goals. And I'll talk about those in a minute. In Central Asia, there wasn't really the period of the sort of early privatization in the 90s. The state never lost quite as much control. The state has largely retained control, but it also depends on oligarchs. So oligarchs, their own Central Asian oligarchs maintain important shares in these companies. So let me turn to the question of politics. So this sort of one of the basic points I want to make this morning is that politics and energy are sort of inextricably linked. And why are they linked, and sort of the details I'll illustrate in the next few minutes. So, energy and politics is a big topic. I tried to sort of disaggregate it into domestic and foreign policy. In domestic politics, I divided it into sort of elite struggles that happen in Moscow and social policy issues where the state tries to mobilize oil companies for social goals in particular towns. Okay, so let me talk about domestic politics first. So I call these two categories high politics and micro politics, and this doesn't exhaust the myriad of ways in which energy plays a role, but those are sort of a first cut at how we can think about politics and energy in these countries. So with high or elite politics, I'm referring to the struggles between Vladimir Putin and Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So one of the reasons why Mikhail Khodorkovsky was targeted for this by Vladimir Putin to have all his assets stripped and to be imprisoned was because he had political ambitions that were very threatening to Putin and his circle. Where's my page 4? Sorry. So I'm no expert on Middle Eastern oil politics, but I understand that the oil and the political elite have been fused for many decades. So the same families control oil and politics. That is, for example, also the case in Azerbaijan, which is a country in the Southern Caucasus. It was not the case in Russia because of all these ownership struggles and transfers of ownership, the struggles to control oil were really also the struggles to control politics because of the immense resources that come with controlling oil resources. So perhaps what makes Russia interesting is that these coalitions between the political elites and the oil elites have not been stable. They have been sort of subject to transitions over the last 20 years. And a lot about securing domestic political position is about securing control of oil and gas. Well, another important aspect of energy politics that I want to talk about is what I call micropolitics. And this is really less well known, and it's a more recent area of research, is the role of energy companies sort of on the ground in regional and local politics. I don't know, I think I forgot to mention at the outset, the Russian economy is very, very much dependent on energy resources. I think it's 50% of economic activity or more. It's always criticized by the IMF and the World Bank for being highly dependent on the energy sector. So energy companies are very important employers, but they play a much, much larger role than just being employers, partly as a result of practices in the Soviet Union. They provide infrastructure, they provide housing, they provide assets for hospitals and for schools. And these kind of social roles that are politically negotiated at the local level. It's sort of the mayor who goes and asks the oil company. These kind of local politics of oil were in the 90s very much ad hoc. The Russian state was falling apart. Really, nobody was providing beds for the hospital. Nobody was providing a new playground. So the sort of logical place for regional politicians and local politicians to turn to were the oil companies. But at the same time, the oil companies were trying to become more Western. They were trying to privatize and not fulfill these social functions that they did fulfill in the Soviet Union. But eventually, under Putin, they were increasingly, so in the 90s, there were sort of ad hoc agreements. Under Putin, these oil companies and gas companies have been very much encouraged to play these roles, and some of these local connections were formalized. They're formalized under so-called corporate social responsibility programs. So there's research on what corporate social responsibility means in the Russian context. So I think these are sort of new and interesting ways in which energy companies play a role in Russian politics. Now, what this means for the population is unclear at this point. I think in some ways it's good, people get stuff that they wouldn't get otherwise. But to what extent the people can actually play a role in saying what they want is very unclear. It seems not very much. It's sort of these top-down patriarchal decisions that are made. So I have two pictures of some of this Gazprom corporate social responsibility. This is a children's sports center that Gazprom built in a northern town. It's called Novye Urengoy. It's gleaming, it's beautiful, and it's definitely very nice for the children who can use it. But it's not clear if sort of the community or the region as a whole would have decided to go for that as opposed to roads or schools or something like that. The second picture is about reindeer herders, it's the caption, really, that wasn't my caption. The caption was presents for reindeer herders. So a lot of gas and oil production happens in the far north, very weakly populated areas, but the people who are there are sort of indigenous and native reindeer herders and other populations of the far north. So at first I didn't quite get what the present was, but I think the present is the snowmobile that you see there. So I'm sure the snowmobile is useful, but also at the same time, one of the major grievances that reindeer herders have is that the new development sort of interrupt or detract reindeer migration patterns. So the snowmobile doesn't really help the reindeers, right, in that way. So you'll see that those micropolitics have advantages, but there's a mismatch between who gets to decide how resources are allocated. Okay, let me see. Okay, so let me turn to foreign policy. Again, this is a huge topic, and I'll just get us started a little bit. I'll talk about Russia's relationship with CIS countries first. So CIS countries and Russia are tightly linked through pipelines and through economic connections. Just an aside, Russia calls CIS countries the near abroad. It has its own term for these countries. So it sort of acknowledges, yes, they're abroad, yes, they're independent countries, but they're still sort of near to us. And it sort of signifies how much they want to play a role in this sort of sphere of influence. I said the economic and energy ties are very strong, and that's not surprising because until 91 and for many, many decades in the 20th century, they were part of one economy and not just any economy. They were part of the market economy that sort of really explicitly built these ties to be strong. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, CIS countries became independent, but economies often remained extraordinarily dependent. Just a few things about that. Countries with their own energy resources tended to be more independent, not surprisingly. So Kazakhstan has been sort of considered a partner of Russia. Kazakhstan has its own energy resources, whereas countries like Belarus, Ukraine, and Armenia are very dependent on Russia. Just to give you an example, Armenia relies for its energy on for all of its electricity on one nuclear power reactor, but it doesn't have the fuel for that nuclear power reactor. So it really depends on Russia to provide that fuel. The three Baltic countries are a little bit of an exception because Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia do depend on Russia, but because they're part of the European Union, they're more independent. Ukraine is dependent on Russia for 2/3 of its energy needs. And I'll turn to Ukraine in just a second. So before I want to talk about Ukraine, I need to talk about the relations between Russia and the European Union. Again, it's a relationship of mutual dependence. Russia depends on energy exports, and most of its energy exports go to Europe. As I think I mentioned this at the beginning, it tries to diversify to China and East Asia, but it takes a long time to build pipelines and have also build agreements about how much energy, who should pay for pipelines at what cost, and these kind of things. The energy ties between Europe and Russia date back to the 70s, so these pipelines are really quite established. So in Europe, different countries are dependent to different degrees. There's a large number of countries who receive over 90% of their energy from Russia. Not surprisingly, they're sort of located in the north and the east, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. A number of East European countries, as well as Greece, receive over 50% of their gas from Russia. And then I highlighted Poland and Germany in red. Germany 36%, Poland 48%, because those are very important countries in determining EU policy towards Russia. So these numbers have shaped European policy towards Russia significantly. There's many, many examples of that. You probably heard that the EU is much more reluctant in supporting sanctions against Russia. And I think this is, the prime reason for that. Now, let me move on to Ukraine before I run out of time. Ukraine is extraordinarily dependent on Russian gas. At the same time, Russian-Ukrainian energy relations haven't been fully marketized for the last 20 years. What I mean by that is that Ukraine hasn't been paying world market prices for gas. Ukraine has been receiving subsidized rates. Russia has allowed Ukraine to pay far less than it would get if it sold the same gas to Germany. Ukraine and Russia have bartered gas, so a lot of Russian gas goes through Ukraine. So Russia wants Ukraine as a transit country. So it said, okay, we're going to give you gas in return for transit rights, right? Because transit rights is another important economic opportunity. So it has bartered, it has subsidized, and also Ukraine has incurred a huge debt for energy resources from Russia. So it just didn't pay. Even if they agreed for certain prices, Ukraine just didn't pay. Ukraine is also dependent on Russia in other ways. Thank you. 1/3 of Ukraine's exports go to Russia. And another interesting fact is Ukraine is at the very, very bottom of the list of energy efficiency. So Ukraine is one of the world's, or I think I read somewhere, it's the least energy inefficient country in the world. I'm not sure if it's really at the very bottom, but so really the harsh reality for Ukraine, it's incredibly energy inefficient. It has an incredibly energy inefficient economy, and it's hooked on cheap gas, right? So these two things go along. As part of the crisis that unfolded in the last 6 months, that cheap gas has just stopped flowing. You might have heard that, in April, early April, the Russian government increased gas prices. It no longer wants to subsidize gas for Ukraine. And then last week, Gazprom said it would turn the supplies off altogether. So what this means for Ukraine and Europe has been trying to reverse the flow. Europe has stockpiles of gas, and it's tried to give Ukraine some of the gas, but Europeans are kind of worried about that too. So it's really, Ukraine is really in a bind because it is very dependent on Russia. And honestly, I cannot tell you how they will get out of this crisis in terms of energy. And this is just the energy dimension of the crisis. There's many, many other dimensions, the military dimension and the Russian ethnics in Ukraine. So I don't think anybody knows really how Ukraine will get out of this crisis. Not in Kiev and not in Moscow, and not sure, even less in Brussels and DC. But so the one thing I think everybody knows and acknowledges is that Russia and Ukraine are at this point extraordinarily linked, and their fates are sort of tied. So I wanted to sum up with sort of a few broader, more general thoughts. So these are all the ways in which energy and politics are linked. And really the question is, why are they linked? And a general answer is that really politics is sort of about the distribution and redistribution of resources. And energy is one of the most valuable, is a quintessential resources in a modern economy. Second point is the politics and economies have been changing so much in this region over the last 20 years that really these questions about who gets to control, who gets to use, at what price, are up for political debates. And so that's the politics of energy have been very dynamic. And the last point is, the geography of resource extraction and consumption places countries in relationships of mutual dependence. And in this dependence has to be renegotiated depending on the politics that come out of the first 2 points. Okay, I think that's it. Mm-hmm.
Can you please speak into the microphone for the sake of our recording? So Ukraine doesn't have the natural gas or the oil resources. Why is Russia so interested in the Ukraine then? Because of the debt that was collected over time?
I think the debt is an important consideration, but I think it's a smaller consideration compared to other aspects that Ukraine can offer to Russia. So the Crimea is one of the largest ports. It's, I think, the only port that allows Russia access to the Black Sea. So as Russia gained access to the Crimea, it gained access to a very important port. It's also part of the Caspian sort of region. So I think there's a lot of reserves that can be sort of exploited. Ukraine itself also has an important industrial belt. A lot of the Russian military production in the Soviet Union, like a lot of military equipment used to be produced in Ukraine. So that's the Donbas region. It has large coal reserves as well. So while it doesn't have as much oil and gas as Russia does, it's still a very valuable economic region. And then, I think there's a lot of, there's a sort of a symbolic struggle as well between, does Ukraine turn towards the West, or does it become part of Russia? I think there's the Western Ukrainians who want to be more independent of Russia, and then the Eastern Ukrainians, where a lot of people are of Russian origin. So it's sort of the struggle, the sort of, which part of the world do they belong to? And that by itself didn't trigger the conflict, but I think it gets sort of folded into these economic questions as well. Does that answer your question?
I have a question. It has to do with the mutual dependence.
Mm-hmm.
Is this maybe Ukraine is just not united, or they're weak, the politicians are weak? If the transit of the
Mm-hmm.
natural gas from
Mm-hmm.
Russia goes through Ukraine
Mm-hmm.
to those countries that are 100% dependent on it, why couldn't the Ukrainian government say, we want free gas for transit? We can shut off this transit. I don't understand why. Are they just that weak politically?
The answer is most definitely yes, because there's a lot of internal division about who gets to control the pipelines even. So yeah, in theory, that would be sort of like the way to sort of stand up to Russia and say that. But a lot of the ways in which assets were redistributed in Ukraine kind of mirrors Russia. So there's a few important oligarchs who were then also sort of dependent on Russia because they sell to Russia. Some of them are Russian. So the Ukrainian elites for a long time were pro-Russian. And at the same time, I think that's always also an important part of the story. Western Ukraine wants to be more European, but the European Union really hasn't had that much to offer in reality. Europe, wants a Western-looking Ukraine, but they can right now not realistically offer membership. Ukraine is a very large, poor, corrupt country. Europe has its own set of problems with Greece, which is a small, corrupt country. So they're sort of loath to incorporate Ukraine. So many sort of looking to Russia and asking Russia for help for its economic problems has been sort of more realistic, and first Yeltsin and then Putin were really more forthcoming with actual help than the European Union was. With Europe, there's these agreements for cooperation and friendship. I don't know their official title, but it hasn't been, it's been less tangible.
So the energy reserves that were on that one map, are they filled? Is there a lot of energy there? Is there a lot of natural gas, a lot of oil, and is it easily extractable?
My understanding is that yes, there's a lot there, especially in terms of natural gas, and I think the calculus changed a little bit with the sort of shale gas revolution. Is that for a long time, people thought that gas was sort of concentrated in one place, and we could build our infrastructure, the extraction and the pipelines around that one place. And in Russia, it was really the Far East, because people thought there's a lot of untapped resources in the Far East. And if you actually go to Russia, it's quite extraordinary how vast this Far East region is and how thinly populated it is compared to China, that's just right on its southern border. So China doesn't have a lot of energy resources, but it has a huge booming economy, right? And Russia is sort of the opposite. It has a relatively weak economy, but it has a lot of resources. So a lot of the plans for how to develop energy resources were about the Far East, and especially the Sakhalin Peninsula. And I understand that with shale gas, this has sort of changed a little bit, and also demand has changed in Western Europe. And right now, there's all these conversations about, well, should we get Europe less dependent on Russia, and how can we do that by developing shale gas in Poland? But yeah, so there's a number of connected conversations, but my understanding is there's a lot of reserves that are proven reserves.
I actually have both a comment and a question. The comment being, listening to your material, it strikes me that this could be the basis of a really fantastic strategy game to play with students, where you see the intrigues and the power plays on a number of different levels, as you said, the micro-political, the high politics, not to mention then the international politics. And following from this, I was thinking about something that's been commented on in the United States, where famously, what was it, in 2008, there was a plan to build gas importing docks in several places around our coastline. And now, in the aftermath of the shale gas revolution, as some people call it, there has been talk about turning these import ports into exporting stations. And that's been mentioned especially given the political controversies around Ukraine and the political use of gas resources by Russia. Is this something that is leading policymakers in Moscow to sweat? Is it at this point just talk? Is it a viable counter strategy to the politics Russia has been setting forth?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I don't think Russian leaders sweat quite as easily as maybe European leaders, because the resources are so vast. And I think also it takes a very, very long time to develop this infrastructure. I I'm not sure what the long-term strategy will shape up to be. All of this infrastructure is extraordinarily expensive too, and so to build facilities for Europe, you'd have to have a partner who could sort of legitimately benefit from it. I think Russia is sort of sitting calmly on its reserves, and one of the reasons why Putin has been so popular at home is because he sort of was retelling the Russian story. We are a great power. We do have a lot of energy resources. We have been sort of slighted in the 90s by the winners of the Cold War, but we are reemerging as an important country. And I think that sort of story resonates very powerfully in Russia, and is based on sort of a calm, like, reassessment of its reserves. But I think these things are extraordinarily dynamic, and as you mentioned, the sort of liquid natural gas terminals, I think that's a great example. In Russia, it's the question, what happens to energy resources in the Arctic? So for a long time, the Arctic was another region where Russia wanted to prospect and where it felt it could tap a lot of resources. But it's very cold up there. Everything's frozen, so it's very expensive to get these resources developed. And with shale gas, other options became more important.
You mentioned a particular economic class, the oligarchs. Mm-hmm. About how many major wealthy families would that entail in Russia?
That's a good question. I wish I could answer it. I think, in the 90s, people were really talking about maybe a dozen really, really wealthy and really, really famous oligarchs. So those are the richest, the richest, guys who control the biggest companies. But then when you actually look at regional economies, there was, in a particular region, there would be regional oligarchs whose wealth wouldn't compare to the the large oligarchs, but they would still play a really important role in regional politics. Now, people describe Putin's strategy as sort of a carrot and stick approach, right? So he used to stick on Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Boris Berezovsky is another very important oligarch who controlled a lot of the media. He was forced into exile. And so Putin used the rule of law, or the more arbitrary, whole different topic. Anyways, Putin scared some of the oligarchs with the tools of the state, either into exile or in prison. And then for the other oligarchs, he sort of used a bunch of positive reinforcement. Well, you can keep your assets if you do this. So in this process, the number of oligarchs really has shrunk. And I would say now it's probably more like half a dozen really, really wealthy people who control these big companies and have a very high public profile. But then there's other people within the state apparatus who have become incredibly wealthy through this sort of consolidation of the oligarchs, that are no longer sort of, they're not out in the open. They're Putin's people, and they're now as wealthy as the oligarchs, but nobody knows about what they own and how they control their wealth. Is that Abramovich? Yeah.
American professional sports teams are now have Russian owners.
Yeah, and Chelsea football team too, right? Yeah. So I think that's a minor asset in some of these guys, but still very important.
How popular is Putin in his country?
He's very popular. I haven't been able to talk about the 90s. The 90s are a very, very interesting period. People had really high hopes for democracy and market economies. Voucher privatization really sort of promised that, yes, you've been working at this company for 40 years. Now you can own part of this company. Now, your future can be secured in a different way. It's no longer the state that gives you pensions, but you can be part of part of the market economy. As I said, there's a lot of insecurity that actually took place. People weren't getting their salaries. Companies just, closed. There's like the economic depression in the 90s was more severe than the Great Depression. Like it was 40% of economic activity just, disappeared. And people were not getting paid for months and months and even years sometimes. So do you guys remember the government shutdown last year? I think that created a lot of anxiety because people just didn't know when their salaries would restart. But there was still kind of certainty, well, we will get our paychecks soon. I think in the Russian economy, it was like that for a very, very long time, and it was a lot more uncertainty. And people sort of also felt betrayed as democracy and market economy didn't work out for the vast majority of people. So in that context, Yeltsin was blamed for that, and Putin was sort of hailed as the person who tried to, again, secure people's lives. And he did that by controlling energy resources and sort of just channeling energy into local communities in various ways. And now he's even more popular because, great power adventures and gaining territory abroad has, traditionally been a good way to bolster popularity. Mm-hmm.
What is the source of Putin's wealth?
It's a good question. So his background is in the KGB, and he's sort of known to have a very modest background. He was sort of a low-level operative in the KGB, and he did not have much personal wealth. Right now, it is very, very unclear what his wealth is and where it is, and it's generally assumed to be immense. But it's very unclear. I think, not even the CIA knows, right? They tried to freeze his assets, but they didn't know what to freeze, right? So they kind of targeted some trading company incorporated in Switzerland, He must be, yeah. It wouldn't surprise me. But it's unlike the early oligarchs were very ostentatious, and it was very clear what they owned because they told the whole world about it. They got big villas in London and, all the... but the new oligarchs are much more discreet, partly because of this experience that it can be expropriated.
Let us thank Susanne Wengle for her presentation.
Thank you.